Hello, welcome once again. We're back, we're in charge, we're large, and we're doing things with books. That's right, I'm talking Vlogmas books, my top 5. What else can I say? My top 5 books that I grabbed off the shelf. That's right. I love a lot of books, I've read a lot of books in my time, as you know from my last Vlogmas episode. So there's a lot of books I don't have that I love. I will be giving a couple of honourable mentions after my top 5. Some of which I own, and some of which I've lost over the years. So I will start with my favourite book. Bum 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 bum. Frank Herbert's Dune, June, however you wish to pronounce it. I consider that to be one of the best, to be the greatest science fiction story ever written. And frankly, it could well be one of the greatest books ever written. I've read a decent number of the classics. I still haven't made my way through the entire canon, but I'm getting there. And in terms of complexity, Dune still stands up there. It's a book about Duke Paul Atreides, who was known by his Fremen name as Muad'Dib, which I think is like Little Mouse or something like that, or like Kangaroo Mouse. And basically he becomes Space Emperor after being dicked over by the villainous and kind of gay pedophilic Harkonnens, who are really fat and ugly and horrible, and they're just evil in every generic way. But it's a nice way. I mean, why have you not wanted to have a floating fat man? I can talk a lot about this book. It's a book that leads to a lot of analysis. Rightly so, because there's a lot of depth in it, a lot of interesting stuff about religion, politics, and economics, plus speculative technologies, and sort of even deviations on ecology and genetics, and sort of the idea of genetic drift within mankind. In fact, it's there's no aliens in Dune, which I really quite like. Herbert sort of strayed away from that, and I can't think of any of his novels where he dealt with aliens directly. Pardon me. Yeah, I can't think of any novels that did that. But I could easily be wrong on that. I just haven't read that one, or I'm just forgetting it. So, yeah. Another science fiction, The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. Once again, another political science fiction. I love politics. I think it's a fascinating aspect of humanity. It's often the dirtiest, but it's worth looking into. Now, The Dispossessed is a very interesting book. Once again, it's part of a series, this time called the Hanish Cycle, if I'm remembering correctly. It's been a few years since I've looked into that, and I didn't check out any of this stuff before I recorded it. Oh, pardon me, I'm recording this at midnight. It's so I will stick with Hanish Cycle. I've read most of it. That cycle at this point is very interesting. Human interaction across a number of worlds, dealing with strange cultures, and it's kind of this loose mix of sort of future humanity who are in this semi-loose empire. It's sort of more of a trading commonwealth. Interesting stuff on that level. But The Dispossessed is particularly interesting. Now, this is the first science fiction novel of Le Guin's I read. I only really knew her for fantasy before that. She'll be showing up later in the video for that. So, what do we have in The Dispossessed? Well, we have a planet of basic mega capitalists, and there's a moon of anarchists, of true anarchists. No one controls anything. Even down to their language, they are egalitarian. You do not say my hand, you say this hand which I use. And I think that's a wonderful complexity of culture. Now, it's an artificial culture, but it shows sort of the level of complexity that can be woven into a culture. And the first half of the book is dealing with this anarchist world on the moon. The main character is a scientist, he's a physicist, and he's invented a device that will allow instantaneous communication. Well, he's and that's kind of an important part of the other books in the Hanish cycle. So this communication between worlds allows the Second Empire to flourish. So he's the only contact between the people on the moon and the people on the planet. Is like a monthly ore drop, because the moon is rich in ore which they mine, basically just to get the people on the planet to ignore them. And there's no conversation. But this scientist and a group of others feel that things have stagnated. So they get in touch with the people on the world. This upsets everyone on the moon, and the scientist flees to the planet. And he finds out the other side is as equally convoluted and horrible, because when he's on the moon, the planet's sort of is said to be completely all horrible and evil and blah 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 blah. But then the world of the anarchists is shown to be rich and complex with its own deep flaws, but it still kind of works and is in its own way beautiful. Then on the planet, the moon is shown to be a backward, stupid barbarians, and we live in a utopia of technology, but everything's very rigid. There's massive social divide, and in the end there's a revolution. I won't spoil the book from there. A lovely book and an excellent look, an excellent idea. That's what the Hanish cycle is wonderfully about. It's so many great ideas. The word for world is forest, an excellent sort of space Vietnam novel, or The Left Hand of Darkness, which I think that's the right one. I think so. If I'm wrong, tell me in the comments. About a society that doesn't have gender. A human coming to this alien, a kind of human deviant, but maybe alien. I can't remember exactly. It was read it a long time ago. Where they don't have gender, so the various ways that this world has been changed because of that. But they're not asexual. They still breed. They just take on male and female characteristics, dependent on all manner of interesting cues and social elements, and it's very, very interesting. So, Hanish cycle, excellent. The Dispossessed, the best of it, in my opinion. The next one is something a little bit different. Now, this isn't the exact book, but there's a story here. Now, Allen Ginsberg selected poems. I love Allen Ginsberg. He's my favourite poet. I think there's such raw emotion in his work, and it's so powerful in such a way. I love poetry. The original purpose of this channel was for me to read poetry to people, because I like reading poetry. In fact, that's kind of what I did with What the Folk. I like to read to people. It's a folly of mine. So, Howl is the main poem of that. That's still the most viewed video on this channel, is Howl. And the original copy of this book I had was a little pocket edition that was Howl, Kiddish and other poems. I loved that novel, and literally, that little book, and literally wore it out. I don't normally wear out books. I'm very careful with books. It's to the point where I don't use proper bookmarks. I use ribbons so I don't damage the page. If you have a paper bookmark, anything thicker than newspaper print, that will damage the page. I don't use them. It kind of frustrates people. I bought you this lovely bookmark, but it damages the pages of my books. I don't break spines when I can, though some of these have got fairly damaged spines because I've had them for years. In fact, the next book is a good example of how well I take care of a book. A lot of my books, you can't tell I read them, which I'm kind of proud of. I'm kind of proud of that I have all these books that you can't tell I've read them because I keep such good care of them. It's kind of silly, I know. So, I won't talk any further about Ginsberg's poetry. I'd recommend you read it. Or if you want a good film introduction, there's a documentary called Howl, which is just brilliant. It actually it got me back into poetry. I loved poetry when I was younger, and then it kind of died out or got replaced by a love of film. And then when I was in film school, I watched this documentary, Howl, and it reawoke my love of poetry, and I've not really looked back since either. Yeah, rambling. Okay. The Life and Opinion, of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, by Lawrence Stern. This is the oldest book in this collection, printed in the 17th century, I want to say. Fair while ago. It's pretty much the origin of British humour, as far as I'm concerned. It is hilarious. If you like dry British humour, if you like sort of the good wordplay of Python, or P.G. Wodehouse's novels, or any classically British humour, you will like this novel, because that is what it is. It is quintessentially British in its humour, and as far as I know, it is the start of it. It's a book in 3 volumes about the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, starting from his conception, because the book has wonderful characters. His father, to get the proper sort of mould to his child, the conception must be done in the proper mood, with the proper mind frame behind it. So he spends a long time in a meditative think before he takes upon the act, which he does reluctantly, clearing his mind from the thoughts of the rotting of beasts. And then so there's all this mixture around the family, and he has an uncle who is the sweetest man in the world. He is just so sweet, and it's just sort of, he's a beloved British anorak. He follows the war going on. I can't remember which war it is. I think it's the Napoleonic War. Could well be. And he was a soldier himself. Him and his butler, they follow the war going on in the paper. From my knowledge of the history of the time, this is the first time we had papers like this, so this is kind of tying into that. And he reenacts them in his garden, making props and makes cannons out of old boots, and like moving cavalry charges and infantry charges to, simulate all these battles going across the world that he's read in the paper. He's sort of, but it's so innocent. It's like a grown man playing with trains, and it's sort of his resort when he's stressed is to hum the little bolero, which is an old marching song. I can't recommend the book enough, and I don't think enough people have read it. It's hilarious at times. I actually listened to it as an audiobook first, and then I bought the book and read it again, because it was just so funny and so very British, and I love British humour. I mean, not in a sort of jingoistic sort of way. It just resonates with me well. I was raised on Python. So yeah. Number 5, Earthsea Quartet by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is sort of, I consider this some of the best fantasy ever written. Now, Tolkien has his place. He was a brilliant writer, and I respect the man for a lot of reasons. I mean, I kind of model myself after him in a number of ways. We both share a great love of language, and his translations of the various sagas I've read and I really enjoy. But I think as a fantasy novel, as a fantasy setting, The Lord of the Rings takes too much from the sagas. It gets too bogged down in the genealogies and the histories and the myth and the world building. Whereas Ursula Le Guin, she makes a fantasy world that is beautiful, and it sort of, it lives on its own. It doesn't require all of these other, it lives in the moment. A lot of Lord of the Rings in particular, I felt The Hobbit was a lot better at this. And I actually rate The Hobbit as a far better book than The Lord of the Rings as a series. With Lord of the Rings, you need to know, or you need to be cognizant of a lot of the history and the world existing around it. So it's nice. It's an excellent series, and I enjoyed reading it. But I think Le Guin adds a level of adds a certain beauty to the world, a certain magic, for lack of a better term. The world feels more magical. It feels more mysterious and strange. But there's no orcs and goblins. Yes, there's shadow creatures, and there's the world of beyond, and the land of death where they go to, and there's dragons, but it's all done in a very different way. I think the second book in the series is the best, Tombs of Atuan. It's sort of always left me with a sort of strange love of fantasy set in desert environments. But I think she really overcomes stumbling blocks of the characters in the first novel, which I think was, there were bits that just were sort of smoothed over in the first one, whereas the second one is a very tight story. If you're looking for a more modern fantasy writer who's similar, I'd recommend Robin Hobb and the Living Ships trilogy. Not so much the Assassins trilogy or the one about the poisoner. I don't think that one's as good. But the Living Ships, Living Trade Ships, or whatever it's called, I think is very similar and has that similar sense of wonder. Okay, so my runners-up, if you will. These are 3 books that I really like, but for one reason or another I can't claim as favourites. So the first one is The Stars, My Destination by Alfred Bester. Now this is a weird novel. Mankind has developed the ability to teleport with their mind. And there's people who can only teleport, say a mile. Others can teleport the other side of the world. And sort of people are graded on how far they can teleport, but it doesn't sort of reflect your social status. It just means, well, he's a bit slower, he can't do these certain jobs. Basically, people can teleport very far, just curious. And there are spaceships, but there's sort of such a weird and complex world build. The main character is a survivor of this spaceship disaster who gets stuck in the spaceship debris and has to survive there for, I think it's sort of, I can't remember if it's 6 months or 3 years. It's a harrowing amount of time. He sort of spends most of his time trapped in this closet, the only airtight bit of the ship. He sort of cobbled together this sort of pseudo airlock, and he keeps things running because he was a mechanic on board. Until he eventually manages to get back to Earth somehow. And by this point he's gone insane. But the thing is, he's constantly, overbearingly wanting revenge. Because this ship came out to investigate the debris. He set off the signal flares. They should have rescued him. They failed. And it's just through this rage and this insanity that he's able to save himself. And sort of over the course of the novel, he goes through all these weird places, and it's a weird novel. It's sort of, there's almost too much in there for me, but it's so crammed full of ideas. I love it. What's the next one? I had all 3. Remembered a moment ago. Oh yes. When Gravity Fails by George Alec Effinger. Now, I mentioned the 2 sequels to this in my first vlog. This is a detective novel set in an Arabic setting in Algiers, I think. No, south of Algiers. I can't remember. It is never very specifically said, but it's sort of set within a city called the Boudin, which is sort of a mixture of ghetto and red light district and slum. And Marid is this hustler. He will do anything, but he's not like the main character from Neuromancer by William Gibson, who's at the point of death. You know, he's stopped caring about his life. Marid wants to carry on living. He's very happy. He has his drugs. He has all these weird and wonderful drugs, and he's constantly on them, and he's constantly high. And he's sort of got this girlfriend, and he loves her, but they're constantly fighting. But there's a murder, and he's tapped to solve it by Papa, who is kind of this crime boss of the city. Now, Marid hates augments. People can get their skulls wired, so they can have datis, which is just data packets, or modis, which modify your personality. Now, what Papa does to Marid is gives him an experimental one that allows multiple modis to be inserted and multiple datis. And also is directly wired to his pain centers, so whenever Papa is bored or, displeased, zap, unending agony. It's literally to the point where he can kill himself. He can force Marie to die from pain. Sort of the most horrible way, and it can last for as long as Papa wants. And it's the classic detective thing of he's forced to solve this murder. But it's such a rich and vibrant world of this sort of down and out community in this cyberpunk era where nation states have kind of collapsed, but not gone the corporate route like most cyberpunk stuff. It's just the big ones have collapsed and they're reforming and collapsing all the time, and everything's in political turmoil, but people are still getting on with their lives. And that's kind of, as the series continues, we learn actually that's Papa's business. He keeps things going. He is the guy who holds all the records to all these countries so that, the taxes can still be paid on time. He's not actually a crime boss. That was a side thing for his, brothers and sisters to do while he was making all this money so they had jobs. It's a wonderful, wonderful novel, and I really recommend it. It's kind of a cyberpunk novel that slipped under the radar, and I wonder if it's because of that, because of the Muslim setting. It's really nice to have a science fiction novel that's set in that world. I mean, I think the great thing about science fiction is it can be from any culture. There's certain novels that have to be in certain cultures, but cyberpunk and a lot of science fiction, and most fantasy, can be anywhere. And we don't always have to have, everything being neo-Nipponese in California or whatever. I think it's worth blending everyone and not demonizing anyone, because at the end of the day, everyone's people. Also, there's a couple of great phrases I've taken from the book. There's one which may actually be an actual Muslim saying, Inshallah, which is kind of a shrug of going, as God wills, which is not as God wills. The good thing is, as God wills, whatever will happen. And there's another one that's a lot more mercenary, but I quite like. Action is action and business is business. It says what it is. Action is action. Business is business. It's, don't hold it against me because I robbed you. I'm still your friend. I just needed the action. So, the final runner-up. And this was very, very nearly in my favourites. It's just was pipped because I had 5. If I was doing a top 10, it would have definitely been in there. And this is American Gods by Neil Gaiman. This is an early urban fantasy novel. I love urban fantasy. It's one of my favourite genres. Really, cyberpunk and urban fantasy are my favourite genres, and they very often mix, which is why Shadowrun is such an excellent game. So, what is up with American gods? The gods are real. They live in the world. They're dying out. They want the power back. And we have Shadow, who, actually, one of the few person of colour, black, mixed race. I'm not. It's never clear what it's never clear his ethnicity. The only time he's described is having the skin the colour of coffee. So I take that to mean he's a person of colour. Well, he would have to be mixed race. That's a spoiler for the book. Anyway, he gets involved in this kind of thing of helping these old gods reclaim their power. And it's such an interesting character story of a person you never see. It's entirely first person, and that what I said is literally the only description I can think of Shadow. He's a shadow of a man. He's not really there, but there's also so much character to him. And that's the true joy of American Gods, is the various characters, the various gods, meeting Odin, meeting Thoth, and then there's the new gods like internet and money and all those assholes, and they're complete dickbags. Pardon me. And I've rambled way too long, but those are my 3 runner-ups. Not really runner-ups, it's just 6, 7, and 8, whatever. Those are my favourite books. Major caveat to this entire video that I've begun with, I've read a lot of books. I probably did, I know I already said this, but I'm going to say it again just to make sure you realise. I've read a lot of books. I've probably forgotten some of my favourite books. I've read that many. I've read 123 books this year. That's not far beyond what I normally read. I'm something of a voracious reader. So, and I could, if I sort of sat down and did like genre and had a few Wikipedia searches and really nailed down a list, I could probably give you a lot of different books. But this is, off the top of my head, my 5 favourite books that I found on my bookshelf. So thank you and good night. Don't know what Dan has planned for tomorrow, and I don't know what I have planned for the day after that. So we'll see. It's all fun round here. Good night.